Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon also to those joining us online for the meeting in public of the Northern Ireland Policing Board. You're all very welcome. This is, of course, the Board's first meeting in public with you, Chief Constable, since your appointment in July, so that we know that you had a busy couple of months taking up post. As we made clear on the first day in office, whilst the Board is your accountability body, we are also here to advocate for you on policing issues that we believe will contribute to the effectiveness of the service provided to the public. There are particular challenges ahead for the PSNI, including pressures on budgets, resourcing issues, and issues arising for policing here from the EU exit. Last week marked 25 years since the ceasefires were called, and next week marks 20 years since the publication of the Patent Report, which was the bedrock for our policing change programme. Of course, what Patent didn't envisage was the continued threat to our officers and the attempts to murder them, as we saw in East Belfast, Craigavon and Fermanagh. The control that these dissident and paramilitary groupings have in our communities is not wanted, and as a board, we roundly condemn all such activity and support your officers in their work. There are clearly issues that need to be sorted so that our peace progress and peace process continues to move forward. Within the board and within policing, it is our job to make sure that policing continues to provide a good service so that confidence in the community continues to be built. We are very aware of the changing demands from the public, but what hasn't changed is the desire for policing to be connected into communities and to deliver the type of policing service that is visible, accessible and engaging. Finally, before I hand over to you, Chief Constable, as a board we had our business meeting yesterday, and we will be moving to sequence other appointments to the senior team, starting with the Deputy Chief Constable's position being advertised in a few weeks' time. So, Chief, thank you for your report, which we've all read and we've had some discussions with you on. We've had some questions on that, but before we move into the questions here, we would like to take some introductory remarks from you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and other members of the board, and also for those comments of support. It is quite an important occasion for me, as you say, the first time I'm here to reflect back on some of my understanding and some of my perceptions of policing and leading PSNI. You've had the report, which you've had a chance to read, but I thought it was just prudent to bring out a few highlights before we can move on and take some questions and some of the other items. I think firstly, for me, having spent nearly 10 weeks here, one of the highlights in terms of reflection has been we have got through some of the parades, bonfires, without significant disorder. I know there's been some issues that have caused concern, without significant damage to property or large numbers of people or indeed my officers injured. So I think that's something that's a good start. Notwithstanding some of the commentary that has been about how we police some of those issues, I think the flip side is also about one of the real highlights was both from a policing operations point of view, but also I think what it meant to Northern Ireland and indeed beyond was how we went around policing the golf tournament in Portrush. As you know, you and I spent some time there, and I think the strong message that I got was consistent and unanimous praise for the tone, the style and the professionalism of the policing operation, which supported, I think, an event that everyone recognised was so important to both tourism and the economy and the broader reputation and image of Northern Ireland. So I think that's good. The other side that's been a tempo and a backcloth to some of the policing issues we've all had to wrestle with over these months has been the continued severe threat of terrorism and the worry and the sinister worry of attacks planned to maim or kill my officers, and the concern I think that's been expressed in a number of places, is this a spike or evidence of a longer term trend? And we need to sort of make sure that both the PSNI and other agencies we work with keep on top of preventing and suppressing that awful type of evil crime. There's a few issues I think are probably worthy of teasing out in more detail, but I thought it was just important again just to give you some headlines about some of the operational things that we're doing almost in the here and now before I go into some of the more fundamental items in the report. Firstly, it's to introduce George Clark as our lead now for Brexit and the policing operation. Steve and I and some of the team have really reflected on the pace of change in Westminster and the sense of preparedness, and we thought it was wise actually to understand where we've got to in terms of what we're doing in terms of resilience, scenario planning, all the relationships with government and other agencies, and to streamline the command so there's one person in charge going forwards. So George will be picking that up alongside his work in relation to legacy investigations. So I think that was something you'd want to know about. Going into the kernel of the report, I think the big thing I want to sort of share with you that having listened, and particularly to the messages that I've heard as part of my preparation for the role, conversations right across the country when both from my own officers, from the public, from other partners I've met, and clearly from the state, from yourselves as well. I'm really pleased to be able to sit before you here today and announce an increase in our neighbourhood policing footprint. I want to commit to growing that by 400 police officers, beginning now with an aim to having them in post by March of next year. There is clearly a lot of detail to work out, but I think that improving neighbourhood policing, notwithstanding the commentary that's come out of your own review, is so important to actually building on the work of my predecessor and ensuring confidence and trust in the PSNI. I think what that will look like is a conversation around what I describe as a universal offer. So confidence that geographic areas in Northern Ireland will have a named and dedicated officer. You will know that Simon Byrne represents your patch in terms of dealing with the problems of concern to you, but equally there's some more work to do over the coming weeks to try and make sure that we can describe to you how we'll also increase the policing footprint in those other areas of need over and above that. At the moment, to give you some sense of the change, we have just over 300 officers fulfilling that role. By the end of the spring next year, March, we want to grow that to over 700, and that's work that Mark and I will be doing, which obviously we will want to keep you briefed on. In that space, I suppose, when you say about how important policing communities is, I recognise the beginning of the conversation is often contact with PSNI. How well we do that, how easy it is to get through on the phone, I recognise is hugely important. And we've begun some work to improve how, in the one-on-one service, how quickly we answer the phone. That's seen significant improvement over a matter of weeks, where we're now seeing regularly that we're hitting our own targets of hitting 7 out of 10, at least of those calls, within the times we've set. And that's a tribute to some of the work that Mark and his team have done behind the scenes, and I think is at the beginning of some improvement in that regard. The other things I think you'll be interested in is, notwithstanding what we're doing about the front face of policing, I'd also want a conversation in the months ahead about two significant issues. One, how we modernise working practice so that we can invest in the latest technology, both for frontline officers but also for police staff, to see how we can embrace better the concept of agile working, which I think will give more flexibility to what we do, boost productivity and make better use of resources, and actually make work as an experience for our staff more rounded and more flexible. If we can achieve that over the next couple of years, I think the other side of the conversation is a workforce that we can utilise in a different way means we can also see how we use our estate in a different way. My impression, and obviously you will all know some of the detail better than me, that we're trying to lead the policing endeavour here, the fight against organised crime and terrorism, from an aged estate. It lacks investment, there's huge backlogs in terms of maintenance, and we're trying to sort of push that fight against crime and terrorism from 185 porter cabins and for buildings that range from few quite new, but some up to 200 years old. So I welcome the support of the board to see how innovative we can be to transform both how we use the estate, how we improve the estate, but the whole look and feel, and how we connect better to communities and use that as one of our levers to improve service. The other thing I think I'd like to do is, having listened carefully in the few weeks I've been here, is see how we can improve the sort of way we look and feel in terms of the PSNI. So I've spoken with the Federation and with colleagues, and I've commissioned a review of our operational uniform. Where I want to get to is an operational uniform that broadly respects tradition and some of the strong values of PSNI, but effectively is operationally more practical, more functional, and more easy for our frontline staff to use when they're policing round the clock. I think what you see myself and colleagues wearing today in terms of woolen trousers that get wet and shirts that don't work with body armour are fine for us, but I think I want to see how we can use good practice elsewhere to modernise both the uniform and improve protective equipment. So I've written to you about, is the time right to introduce split hoods as part of the operational tactics that staff would use here. I think the final thing to say, apart from happy to take questions and what we need to do in relation to reflection and learning, is just to close my comments down by acknowledging that I made some remarks yesterday at the end of a conference in relation to stop search, which I know attracted a lot of interest. I think I need to put those remarks into context. And the last thing I wanted was a narrative and a commentary that both distracted from what we were trying to do yesterday, but broad relationships going forwards. And I recognise that in some cases that's hit a raw nerve. What I was trying to describe was my commitment to increase the tempo and the pace of the fight against paramilitary crime in communities right across the country. I think there's an opportunity to use all of our powers, both in an investigative sense and in a disruptive sense, to tackle the evil scourge of paramilitary crime, which consistently, I hear, gives concern to communities right across the country. However, I recognise that my enthusiasm to talk in sound bites has caused a distraction, and I want to sort of place on record my commitment to recognising the importance of safeguarding and protecting children. What I was not trying to describe was a blanket policy. I was not trying to describe something that's applied retrospectively, and I was certainly not trying to see children as a weapon or pawn in the fight against tackling paramilitary crime. And obviously I can take questions on that later.
Thank you very much for that. As a board, we very much welcome the introduction of the new number of officers and the commitment to that. This is an issue we felt very strongly about, and one which was raised consistently throughout the consultation process. As a board, through the partnership committee, we'll explore that with you as to what that actually means for local communities and what the timescales are for having the officers in position, and indeed contact arrangements and assurances that they will not be extracted to fill gaps, that they will actually be dedicated to the neighbourhood work. We will also want to take your advice on resourcing requirements for the service, because the need to increase the number of officers, I think, to make a case for that long term is probably upon us now. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move into questions. And the first question is from Keith Buchanan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable, for your comments. My question, Chief Constable, relates to an interview carried on the Nolan show back on the 15th of August this year, where a self-confessed IRA man blatantly gave some terms, which I'm going to quote to you. He took a gun and hijacked a car. This is his quotes. He didn't do enough. He was going out to maim and destroy this British establishment, and he couldn't do enough. When asked by Mr. Nolan, are you openly saying you would have killed more people? He answered, correct. I was worried. He also quoted, he was never worried about the police, ever. So I'm not going to be worried about them now. That was his direct quotes in that interview. These comments concern me personally and concern the community I represent. This man's disregard for law and order and the consequences of it, and his lack of concern for doing this in live video. So your comments previously referred to concern for child protection. This was at 9:10 in the morning when the school run was on. So lots of young people hear those comments and the disregard to the life this man had. So my question directed to you is, what is the PSNI's position on this, and what plans are in place to address it?
Thank you, Keith. Well, firstly, no one could stand behind comments as nasty and disrespectful to civil society like that. I think the best thing I can say in terms of reassurance, that's now an active line of inquiry, and because of that I'm somewhat limited in the detail I can give at the moment, but as the inquiry progresses, perhaps by the next meeting I can give you some more detail.
Next question, Wendy.
Chief Constable, the board continues to have a strategic interest in overtime, its use, allocation and management, including the wellbeing of staff and value for money. My question is about what leadership you are given to take forward the expectations of the board that overtime will be reduced, while at the same time looking at the expectations of officers. A recent media article has indicated their dissatisfaction by the very fact that overtime has now become part of what they see as their normal salary. So could you please indicate what you're actually doing about that?
Thanks very much. I mean, firstly, I share your interest and concern, because it's actually, the overtime is just part of the overall budget and what you asked me to do in terms of managing that sensibly, effectively, and delivering value for money. I think there's a few things that I'd like to sort of reinforce. Firstly, the comments that attracted the attention were no more than us trying to make sure that consistently, right across the PSNI, police regulations were applied with clarity, fairness, and actually abided by the spirit of the regulations. And that's what seemed to have caused some response. As you might imagine, I have regular dialogue with the chair of the Police Federation. I entirely accept on occasions, especially in an environment like this where we need to step up the pace of policing at times, that overtime is a legitimate tool, because at times we need to surge officers into certain investigations or to responses to crimes of the moment, disorder, so on and so forth. So I think it's important that we retain some element of overtime in the budget. You're quite right in your sort of opening comments. I think we need to be mindful of the longer term effects, because like any elastic band you keep pulling, eventually it will snap. And I think overtime and that our need to continually use it is also linked to some comments from the chair that I've said recently. I think we need to aim for 7,500 officers in the PSNI, and that the use of overtime is probably in part symptomatic of the fact that we need more officers to spread the workload across the country to make sure that we maintain the high standards that we enjoy. Personally, and I know from even the dim dark past, I don't think anyone would say it's prudent financial planning for individual officers to assume that their overtime becomes part of the salary. Even when I was a young lad, as it were, it was drummed into you that overtime was something over and above your basic offer, and it would not be sensible financial planning to start buying houses, car loans, etc., on the assumption that you're going to earn so many hours a month. And I know the Federation do a lot of work to reinforce that message. If there are individual cases of hardship because of changes to the application policy, there's ways we can pick up support, but overtime is there to boost officer availability, the amount of resource we have, not to seen as a sustainable source of personal income.
Garett?
Thanks, Chair. Chief Constable, as you'll be aware, our grouping have now met with an organisation on a number of occasions since the Apprentice Boys relief celebrations. You'll be aware right across the band, law and order, unionist community, there has been a significant amount of anger at the police operation on that day, and I think that we will deal with the consequences of that for days, weeks and months to come, and many of us are trying now to pick up the pieces from what happened. When we last met you, Chief Constable, last week, we did provide new and additional information surrounding the PSNI actions on the day. So given the fact, with that information, the Clyde Valley Band, along with supporters and children on the bus, were stopped and held for 2.5 hours before being allowed on their way, despite having committed no crime. Will you, and I appreciate that you yourself are not responsible for the operation on the day, and the language wasn't here, so I appreciate that. But are you now in a position to apologise for what happened that day? But also, would you outline what steps you're taking to try and rebuild the confidence now within that particular community?
Well, yeah, I think I obviously appreciate some of the feedback you gave us in a number of meetings, and also the broader emotion. I think there's a couple of specifics. Obviously, the attention of the coach and the people in it were part of the wider operation. And it wouldn't have fared for me here today in a public forum to say anything that implies that I'm sort of pushing the silver commander that was in charge of this into a place where I'm overtly criticising what he did, because I think it's prudent to sort of take stock and understand all the surroundings that led him to make that decision. But I do recognise the emotion, and that I say it's probably regrettable we are where we are. But before I think it's, in fairness to all parties, a position where I could offer a full apology, I think we need to get the total understanding of the facts. To help us do that, ACC Todd has commissioned our own review. That's going on at the moment. But I think it's also prudent to get some independent assurance of the totality of the policing operation, so we can learn both what worked in terms of the delivery, the engagement with communities, but also specifically the viability of this tactic. So I'll be writing to the Police Chiefs Council Public Orderly to get that assurance, so that we get a subject matter expert in to review the whole circumstances and see where that takes us. I think there's probably also an opportunity to use the board's new human rights advisor, again, for his advice in terms of what we do. In terms of moving forwards, I know Mark is exercised by making sure this happens, that there has begun a process of dialogue back in the community. ACC Todd will be meeting some people next week that represent some of the people that were on the bus to try and explain our rationale, which I think is a really constructive and positive step. And I think if you take it out with just the issue of that day and what happened to the coach, again, Mark and I have been having conversations about how we look at the command structure and the resilience of the neighbourhood teams in Derry, London Derry, so that we can actually move forward from where we find ourselves.
Thanks, Chair. Just a small supplementary on that. And I do welcome the update, Chief Constable, in relation to what you've said. But just to go back again, do you think it was right that, given the sensitivities of the area, the fact that our city is looked upon as a policing model, as a grading model for other areas, do you think it was right that the bus was stopped and held for 2.5 hours with children on board, with people who had no association with the band? Do you think that was right? Just a yes or no?
I think that's regrettable, knowing what I know at the moment, but frankly, as we exercise in other places, there's always the hindsight test. I'm quite convinced from some of the conversations I've had that the decision was made with the right motive. The application of that decision is probably something that we need to learn from and understand the full effect. And I think once I've got the full facts, I can probably come back to you with the answer you're probably hoping from me.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Chief Constable, my party leader, Robin Swan, was present in London Derry at the parade, and did, I think, at the scene try to his best to mediate. And since then, we have had extremely helpful and constructive engagement with your officers around concerns that Robin particularly would have had, having been privy and witness to what went on in the city that day. But in relation to the bus being stopped, could I confirm that it is the case that the band leadership offered police officers 3 names and asked to be allowed to proceed on their way? That offer was not accepted, but subsequently, after the delay, whatever it was, to 2.5 hours, that the Colm commander then became aware that in fact that offer was on the table. Prior to that, he had been unaware, and as soon as he became aware that there was an offer on the table to provide 3 names and subsequently to cooperate with police in identifying everybody who had been in the ban that day. The Gold Commander then gave the order for the ban to be released. If that is the case, and you can confirm or otherwise, it would point to quite a serious breakdown in communication from command on the ground and Gold Command in headquarters. Thank you.
Yeah, I think broadly, with all the caveats, I prefer to wait for the final review, because as you know, there's stuff recorded on computer logs about the time that decisions were made and why. I think it's fair to say there was a breakdown in communication. I don't think there was any sinister or malicious intent. It was just on a busy day when there's lots going on. What was known both on the ground to the Silver Commander, who's the person, if you like, in the middle, and to Gold, we could and should have pushed that up the chain of command quicker, and we didn't, and we accept that. Yes, there was knowledge about names. Again, before I finally confirm it's absolutely 3, I just want to get to the bottom of that through the review, but you're broadly in the right space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Constable. Just let me say this for the record, although I've said it many times before asking the question. We are on record time and time again publicly and at this board in condemning all paramilitary activity, and that goes right across our community. So I agree with when you're saying you're doing an uplift and trying to deal with this crime in our community. However, I can't agree with some of the things quoted that you said yesterday, and if you don't mind, I'll just quote it very quickly back to you. You're saying, this is to the paramilitaries, we will have your house, if you keep going, we will have your car, we will have your kids. And this in particular, we will have your kids. You later said, and I quote you again, that so what safeguarding powers have we got to take your kids into care if that is a deterrent? And it is obvious, I know you said earlier on that you didn't look upon children as pawns, but those statements make the idea of taking children off anyone not to do with the safeguarding of the child, but to do what effect it has on parents. And I think it's totally wrong. I don't often ask people to withdraw comments, but while I agree with a lot of the other things that you said, and it was at a conference around children, and there was many children there, although I understand you said it afterwards, that you withdraw that section of what you said, because it has caused a deep worry. You know that the Children's Commissioner has come out, and I know that other safeguarding institutions are not agreeing with what you're saying in terms of it. So I'm asking you to withdraw that section of what you said, because I do think it's important that we know that the police will not use children as a deterrent. If there's an issue around children which has to be dealt by social services, then that should be done, but not in the way that you have described it, or you described it yesterday.
Yeah, well, thanks for the prompt. I'm quite happy to withdraw the interpretation that children are pawns, if that's what's been heard. It wasn't my intention. What I was talking about in deterrence was how we use powers and policies to tackle paramilitary crime. And I think the thing that's important is about safeguarding. There will be occasions in those sort of investigations, for example, in a search warrant, where officers will see things that cause concern about the safety and well-being of a child. And I was trying to remind officers that there are powers that they can appropriately use there, but I certainly wasn't trying to create the impression that this was a lever to sort of wring compliance, for want of a better word, out of people that are under investigation.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chief Constable, I have to say I welcome that you're prepared to use all powers available to you to tackle paramilitarism and bring these people down. I think the average person in the street would be really glad to see that, because they hate these people who feed off their backs and keep them down. And these people need to understand that there are going to be repercussions and consequences to their actions at all levels of their lifestyle, and that includes their children, because we have to question whether or not these children are being raised in a right and proper constructive environment. 21 years after the Belfast Agreement, these people should be gone. This shouldn't be an issue, but you're left to deal with it because they haven't. And there needs to be a breakdown of this notion that these people control Northern Ireland and that we're living in some kind of mafia state. No, it's time for law and order, and they need to be brought to book. So I welcome that, and I'm encouraged by your remarks. You indicated upstairs just in private, that the removal of children will be in a small number of cases and where there are safeguarding issues for children which are prevalent. To me, there is rank hypocrisy in some quarters of this room, since the IRA has used women and children as human shields for years. So, I mean, I'm astonished at these remarks about pawns because it hasn't cost them a thought in the past. But the question people should really be asking themselves is, should the PSNI or social services leave children in proximity to weapons and ammunition, explosives and drugs and unsavoury characters? Is that really the best option for these children? Where they're left with the concept that this is normality, this is how families behave, this is normal society, when we're spending millions of pounds to break down that notion and return our communities to a sense of lawfulness. So I would suggest to you that all right-thinking, law-abiding people understand and would suggest that children should not be left in those circumstances, that they in these circumstances are not being used as pawns, but rather you're removing them for the sake of their own protection.
Thanks, Joanne. I think the thing to try and get some agreement around what I was trying to say was the safeguarding, the protection, using a range of powers, and that I would not want the message to go out that I'm trying to hold a sword of Damocles over parents. So that we do have defined powers and responsibilities, we have wider responsibilities under the Human Rights Act, so that officers are confronted with a situation where the child is at risk. They have either two choices: to take them into immediate care or to refer the circumstances to social services. That's what they were doing yesterday, and that's what they will do tomorrow to comply with that legislation, and that's all I was trying to emphasise.
Chief Constable, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the policing of the Open at Portrush, an event which certainly highlighted the beauty of our homeland right across the world, if not always promoting the wonderful climate that we have in the good old summertime. But the question I have is not so much around the police. The policing, by all accounts, was very well delivered and appreciated all around. But given the cost of that policing, which I believe is in excess of £1 million, I just wondered what your position was with regard to policing of commercial events and potentially recouping monies that are outlaid in delivering and provision of that policing.
Yeah, I think, I don't know the final arrangements for what we did with the golf in terms of recovery, although I know there was a very strong and active relationship with the organisers. We do have a range of charges we apply for policing services in different scenarios, and I know Mark is sort of studious to make sure that that is done in accordance with agreed guidelines. So if that's the sort of assurance you want, if you need a breakdown of the charges for that particular operation and how it played out, that's something we can write to you about in more detail, if that helps.
Yes, thank you. It would be good to know what that breakdown is, and is that principle applied right across the board, not just for that particular event, which was opened off to some extent?
Yeah, there's a protocol under the headline of Special Policing Services that we will apply to all sorts of different scenarios where we have to put additionality which draws officers off other duties to support that event, but we can give you the detail of what we charge for different ranks and different services.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, first of all, can I thank you since coming to Northern Ireland, taking up your post, for the very proactive way that you've engaged with ourselves and my colleagues on the policing board, and that is appreciated. Also thank you for your comments in relation to increasing the tempo and the pace against the paramilitaries and against those who are a blight on our society and have left indelible scars marked by graves and marked by sorrow for far too many years. That brings me on to the recent interview, if you could call it that, or appearance on Swedish TV by someone claiming to represent the Continuity IRA, and where they stated that they had regrouped and rearmed. Now, obviously that is very concerning, that an organisation can say that they have regrouped and they have rearmed and that they are actively taking orders from the Continuity Army Council. Well, we know what another Army Council heaped on Northern Ireland for far too long. And let's also set this in a context, Chief Constable. This organisation, if it is what it is, or it's just a cover for the broad Republican terror regime, this is the organisation that was responsible for the murder of PC Stephen Carroll in 2009. And I want to have an assurance that, as you have said, you will step up the tempo and the pace against paramilitaries, that no stone will be unturned or left unturned to find out who this individual was and to close down the potential of this organisation taking the life of one of your colleagues and any other innocent civilian.
Well, I think, welcome those comments, Mervyn. I had the opportunity to go and visit the place where PC Carroll was killed a few years ago and sort of try and understand fully in that case what happened and the tragedy that went with it. In general terms, both Barbara and I frequently meet and get involved with other agencies to make sure that we are doing all we can within the resources and powers that we have to keep fighting against terrorism. I think there are some concern about the sort of tempo of recent attacks, and there's different opinions as to whether this is a spike or it's the beginning of a more worrying, sinister and longer term trend. And I think at the moment we'll have to wait a little longer to come to a finite judgment, because you appreciate we get information from a variety of sources. But again, we've said it before, I think we're in agreement about the evil scourge of terrorism, but I've also said in other places that communities are our biggest weapon in the fight against terrorism, which is why I think it's so important that we're investing extra officers into those communities to become our eyes and ears and to garner more information to both investigate and disrupt terrorist activity. But I have little doubt about how relentless the approach is. Barbara and I speak most days about the detail in relation to ongoing operations right across the country to try and thwart this threat as best we can.
And Chief Constable, and maybe Barbara, obviously in terms of non-racial position, but the fact that they said they had rearmed, it raises concerns as to the source of those arms, or the residue of arms from the IRA or other illegal organisations, or are they new arms that have been brought in, and obviously with the concerns in relation to the border and the activities and whatever may happen in relation to being able to secure the border, how we can ensure that the access to those arms is closed down as well.
Well, Barbara made was comments about once. I mean, broadly, I think the concern is the determination to kill or maim one of our officers, and we've seen that play out in recent events, and therefore the motivation is to keep trying to thwart, disrupt, and to catch those small number of people. And let's remember, it's a small number of people intent on that evil. I think in one sense, Mervyn, quite where the gun's from is, I wouldn't say is irrelevant, but the fact that people are armed and prepared to use them, whether they're old weapons, reconstituted weapons, new supply. And again, as you imagine, we have numerous sort of investigative opportunities to try and keep the tempo to make access to farms as difficult as possible. Clearly, any changes to the border dynamic will be something of concern in terms of changes in patterns of people movement, the actual legislation that governs border controls, etc., etc. So it's something we're keeping an active eye on. But I think I'm certainly convinced having spent a lot of time with Barbara and the team, but also with other agencies that we work with, that the fight against terrorism here is relentless.
Thanks, Chair. Chief Constable, in terms of an analysis of the capability of dissidents, are there any indications that former terrorists are now joining the ranks who would have had experience from the past? And also in the context of Brexit and the risks of a no-deal scenario, I know that the Deputy, I think, gave presentations to the Ireland Select Affairs yesterday, so just like to hear a wee bit more about that. And what will be the triggers for mutual aid, and how will you then, given our bitter experience around the arrests of the two journalists, and ensure that there are appropriate safeguards in relation to accountability? Because it is about confidence, and you did say that community confidence and the community playing a role in thwarting dissident activity was critical.
Perhaps if you would hold on the EU exit, because we do have a question on that, so you would mind answering just the listening. Sorry.
I was going to hold and also ask Steve to deal with that, because he probably knows what he said better than I did. Because I haven't got a chance to go into the detail. In terms of where the terrorist capacity is coming from, in terms of former terrorists, new recruits, I don't really think it'd be helpful in this meeting to go into those opinions. I think the worry is that it's a sinister threat and one we take seriously. In relation to mutual aid, there has been a lot of work in terms of preparedness, and in the event of some form of policing emergency, that means that we get to a point where the number of officers that we have at our disposal is stretched and strained, because we have to balance dealing with day-to-day emergencies as well as whatever scenario you can imagine is affecting this country, depending on what form Brexit takes. We've done a lot of work in negotiation with National Police Chiefs Council to agree protocols to activate the request for mutual aid. There is a hierarchy of forces that would come to support the PSNI in the event of that happening, and we will be writing to police chiefs and police and crime commissioners to outline the protocols and memorandum of understanding in terms of conduct and accountability that you mentioned, as well as a raft of other things to balance what you're saying, also the need to give assurance and meet the welfare needs of any officers that are drawn out as specialists or just general sort of people to help with our policing response here, depending on what the ask is at the time they need it.
Okay, Chief Constable, I firstly welcome you to your first public board meeting of the policing board, and I want to try to touch on the subject of EU exit. The Deputy did indeed speak to Home Affairs Committee in Westminster this week, already touched on the EU exit preparation, but can you advise us on PSNI preparedness and planning, and any concerns that you may have about increases in cross-border criminality, and indeed the additional resource implications that may be present in the absence of our access to European arrest warrant?
I think two parts to that. I'll bring Stephen in a minute, because it's only fair that he gives his perspective of yesterday. In terms of resources, obviously we've been given £16 million this financial year to recruit officers to help meet the Brexit ask, and we're now negotiating with the Department of Justice about an uplift again if we need it into next year, because we're all in that sort of unknown phase at the moment. So I think it's critical that we keep the capability to deal with a range of scenarios. Clearly, we've said in numerous occasions recently that the lessons of the past tell us that the border's porous. It's now impossible to police in a guardianship sense because of the number of crossings, the type of environment. It's largely rural, as you know. So there is a genuine concern that probably either side of the border, frankly, given the past and the need or the sort of thirst to exploit opportunity by criminal groups, whereas the smuggling of contraband, people, drugs, firearms, etc., that is likely to increase if there are changes to the environment which we're currently working. We have a good and strong working relationship with Drew Harris and the guards on the other side of the border, and we're trying to develop a policing response. You mentioned the European arrest warrant. There are some mitigations that we can put in place to deal with that issue, probably not as fast or as effective as what we currently enjoy. In a broad sense, it was only at the start of the week I sat down with Mark and Tim Mayers, who have been doing a lot of work to test the detail of the plans that cover operational assumptions, resilience, all the things that go with it. The other Mark has been looking at our business preparedness, so fuel, vehicles, all that sort of stuff you'd expect us to make sure that is match fit and ready. And I'm quite sure that as best we can on the scenario we've currently got, that we can deal with what may or may not come before us. I think you talked about command, and that's the reason we've tried to read one sole goal commander now into the arrangements, so that as we expect either the engagement with the government, both here and in London, to change and probably to increase, as well as the need to brief into partners, etc., that we're asking George to take on that sole role. Do you want to come in on yesterday?
Yeah, so give evidence at the request of the Home Affairs Committee yesterday with two permanent secretaries, Peter May and Andrew McCormick, and Karen Pearson, who works in the Executive Office on EU exit preparations. So trying to not repeat what the Chief has said, so our preparations are well in hand. But I will say there's so much uncertainty that we're doing our best in the context of uncertainty, and there has been a lot of effort and time and consideration has went into that. It has fallen broadly into three areas. One that we call Operation Nebraskan, which has previously been led by Tim, and that is really looking at the long-term effects as associated with EU exit. So in your question you mentioned European arrest warrant. We have been part of policing PLC in terms of the UK, in terms of thinking what will we do if we don't have access to the European justice tools that we currently have. European arrest warrant is one of the most significant. Access to the Schengen information system that is used to alert wanted persons across Europe, for example. Access to ECRIS, which is around criminal records. Those would be some of the most typical ones. So we have been working with colleagues in GB about identifying what would be our fallback positions. So in terms of the European arrest warrant, we'd fall back in the 57 Convention. In terms of sharing information, it would fall back in legislation from 1959. Schengen information system, we would then rely on Interpol to be the vehicle by which we would alert wanted persons. But all these fallback positions, in theory, will work. We're glad to have them, but they're likely to be suboptimal, clunkier, slower. So, for example, at the minute, we can get a criminal record system, generally, a criminal record check, generally done across Europe in 6 days. We think that would probably extend out tenfold, maybe in over 60 days to get a criminal record check done in some countries through Interpol afterwards. There are some other difficulties. So at the minute, we're part of the Schengen information system. When we put someone on that system, they're alerted around those countries around Europe who have access to SIS2, which is most of the countries. In future, we're going to be relying on Interpol. What that means then is that in countries in Europe, we're going to require them to double key. So if they want to alert a missing person to us, they will use the SIS2 system for all the other countries, but we will require them to put it on the Interpol system, I-24/7 system it's called. So we're relying on a certain goodwill from other countries to double key. So there are, when I talk about it being suboptimal, obviously it's going to be slower and clunkier, but there are avenues there by which we can achieve a lot of what we want to achieve. It's just not going to be as effective. Pending, obviously, whatever the withdrawal looks like, then there'll be a negotiation phase trying to replicate the type of tools that we have now in due course. The operational phase, Cookhouse has been led on by Mark, and that is really looking at post-EU exit, what does our footprint look like in communities? how are we going to prepare ourselves to deal with any unrest, any disorder, how are we going to reassure communities, and that work is well advanced. And out of the £16.48 million, we've employed 308 people. For example, 190 of those are going into neighbourhood policing teams. Our key messages from the PSNI is we are not seeking to securitise a border. We're not looking to increase even a securitized profile in the border. We want to work with border communities. We want to work in terms of policing with a community style, working within neighbourhoods, addressing local issues, offering that reassurance, and focusing on the maintenance of relationships. And that's our desire, and that's what we have stressed to government, and indeed we have stressed that we are not a border force, and we do not police the border in that sense. We're not a frontier force. We work with communities about protecting communities and detecting crime. And then the third major strand was business preparedness, which has been led by Mark on my left here, looking at, will we have enough fuel? Will we have enough vehicles? How are we going to manage the parts of our vehicles as they break down? We're looking at our own ability around continuity. You talked about crime. There's cross-border crime now that takes a range of forms. Lots of regrettably, cases that you hear about around smuggling, fuel, tobacco, cigarettes. Those would tend to be the most common. That is going to continue, and I think our simple message is if the whatever the withdrawal agreement looks like and the tariffs that are imposed, if that offers the criminals the opportunity to make more money, they will seek to make more money. That perhaps means that there will be a greater volume of crime and more people attending the crime. One of the things we are concerned about is what will the economic shock be out of EU exit. I think that depends on whether there's a withdrawal agreement or not. I know there'll be different political views even in this room about the extent of the economic shock. But we would be worried that if there was that shock, if we did see people in financial distress, that could contribute to an increase in crime. And as the Chief has already alluded to, obviously then the extra dimension we have in Northern Ireland is the issue of DRs. The recent number of attacks, we've had 4 fairly determined attacks to kill police officers in Northern Ireland this year. We are not saying that that is linked to Brexit at this time, but what we are saying is that we believe that DRs recognise the potential in Brexit for them to exploit it, to gain community sympathy, to maybe gain new recruits, and they are watching it very carefully. And the interview with Swedish TV that Mervyn referred to earlier, that person did talk about the potential that lies in Brexit for them. So we will keep a very close eye on that.
Thank you. Did your question get answered, or did you spend a lot of time?
I know Chair we did, but several months ago, political parties received a briefing from the British Home Office in relation to replacement legislation for the EU arrest warrant and other mechanisms. So I am shocked to learn that you're going to rely on some 60-year-old legislation to fill some of the gaps. So my question then is, have you seen sight of new legislation proposed by the British government, or indeed any new treaties or agreement with other EU states to replace what we already have? And are there any implications for existing European arrest warrants which have already been issued?
No, I don't think there's been any negotiations within the British government, and I think the rest of the EU have been quite clear that until the withdrawal agreement is settled, that there can't be any negotiations on those points. I'm content that the Irish government have made some legislative preparations in the last few months to allow the 57 Convention to operate in terms of extradition, and obviously that's something that we're grateful for. But no, it will be the 57 Convention.
And existing arrest warrants?
Existing arrest warrants, well obviously there's ones in the European Union, excluding Ireland, and there's some in Ireland. We are content that preparations will be such that if there was a disorderly exit, for example, we've been working very close between the DOJ here in Northern Ireland, DOJ in the Republic of Ireland, to ensure that mechanisms and processes are in place to ensure that that there is a seamless transition for those European arrest warrants that are in play, including people who are in custody on foot of European arrest warrants, and there is that has been considered and it is being addressed.
Thank you, Chair. And just from our conversation this morning, Chief Constable, you had raised concern about the capacity of other forces to take on future legacy cases. And in light of that, I'm just wondering, have you had any conversations or have you raised this with the Secretary of State or the NIO? And have they given any indication in terms of implementing the HIU under the Stormont House mechanisms, particularly given the context of the poisonous and toxic issue that legacy is to current day policing? So I'm just wondering if they've given any indication on, also if you have had those conversations, if they've given any indication on whether they are going to implement the HIU on the Stormont House mechanisms?
Frankly, no. I've had the conversations. In fairness to the new Secretary of State, I think it was a very brief thumbnail sketch of issues, imagining the size of the brief that he's undertaking. I've had more lengthy conversations with various officials at both the NIO and the Department of Justice to actually reinforce what my predecessor, Sir George, said, that we are quite clear of the view that we would welcome the establishment of an HIU to remove, just as you say, the impact of legacy onto the organisation. You know, if there's support we can garner for someone releasing the budget that was previously set aside to do this, I'd welcome it. But whilst people have listened to what I've said, there hasn't been any commitment yet to acknowledge our concerns or to release funding to set up an HIU.
Just a very quick supplementary, are there any then plans in place to deal with what will be the legacy issue in the absence of the HIU, given the concerns around that capacity issue?
Well, I think obviously there's a number of strands, as we've probably talked about in the past, that we've got support within the PSNI, and as well as the new Brexit role, George is still going to maintain our response for the agreed sort of breadth of, I think it's 1,100 cases that fall within the purview of his work. We've got the extra work. We've now got former Chief Constable John Boucher leading. He's got a number of specific investigations that he will carry out on our behalf. There's the tail end of work from Scotland, but my concern is actually that as this keeps swirling round and round, and we are asked to refer cases to other parts of the sort of UK jurisdiction, that the capacity is running out. Quite properly, forces in England and Wales are dealing with a raft of issues, examples for the hospital deaths in Hampshire, child abuse in sort of Yorkshire, East Midlands, which are consuming detective capacity. I am writing to the Police Chiefs League to highlight our ask, can we have support for another specific investigation, but to also get some sense of what he assesses the capacity going forwards, because if we can get that clarity, it might help us make a stronger case to government.
Okay, we've still a few questions. We're going to ask Paul, followed by Brice and Philip, and then Joanne and Alan. Start with you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions, Chief Constable, about stop and search. The use of stop and search powers has been in decline across all the police services across the UK except for one, and that is Northern Ireland. And at the conference yesterday in Queen's, I know you attended that conference, there was some discrepancy in the figures that were being used. The academic who produced those figures, John Topping, who has previously come and briefed the board, is saying the increase has been in the region of about 74% from the base figure of, I think, the year 2005, whereas the PSNI seems to be putting that much lower at something like 27%. So given that John Topping has been working closely with PSNI and puzzled about the discrepancy in the figures, the second question really is to do with the significance of all of this in terms of the possible implications in terms of alienation of young people. And it's very well recognised that in previous cases such as the Brixton riots or the London riots of 2011, the use of stop and search was used as one of the, or was thought to be instrumental in creating that sense of alienation. Now, we've had a concern board about the breakdown of those figures in terms of community background, and we've never been able to get that information. We brought our concerns to the independent reviewer of the legislation from Baker this year, and I believe he's pursuing that. But will you be moving to try to ensure that we will get the background in terms of community background of those who have been subject to stop and search?
Okay, thank you, Paul. A range of issues there, so we'll try and sort of break them down. The best of my understanding is, obviously, I met John Topping myself yesterday. I know he's worked closely with us to sort of look at how we can improve our response to this issue. I think some of the confusion, as best I understand it, is that of which figures from which time phrases have been used in this academic work, as well as which year-to-year figures that we would cite in terms of volumes of stop searches, both using powers that require reasonable suspicion or in fact no grounds. I think the other confusing factor in terms of some of the comparators is the uniqueness of those powers here, particularly the Justice and Security Act powers, which skew the figures. If you compare like for like between sort of police and criminal evidence misuse of drug powers between England and Wales, there's greater similarity. There's also some subtle differences in the outcome rates because of the way we would sort of refer people into things like community resolution, which might not be available to forces in England and Wales. So I don't think there's any deliberate attempt to sort of massage figures or confuse people. I think it's just the context in which we're working. And certainly, I still think it's a viable tool in the right circumstances, and that generally my brief was that the trends were down, but that might also be a question of where you pick the start point for where you're using your data. I hear what you say about alienation, and dare I say it, given some of the places you quoted, it seems to be very close to the places I talked about in the speech yesterday. So I recognise, I was talking yesterday not just here, or indeed in London, but we look at US examples where there have been breakdowns in community relations, where stop search has been applied poorly, aggressively, or as a blunt tool. I still think it has its place. The academic research is probably mixed in terms of its long-term effectiveness, but as I said yesterday, in a crackdown consolidation type of policing response, the evidence justifies its use. But I think the key message of yesterday actually was about listening to young people and recognising we can risk alienation. There was a few gems that came out for me yesterday. One young person approached me at the end to talk about our powers to stop people filming the police, which was a myth. So there were little things like that came out of it. On the big issue of community background, I know it's a very important issue, but we can't compel people to define their community background. Sometimes they do when we take details in the stop search environment, but other times they refuse to do that. So we have a void where we just don't know, and it would be dangerous and probably immoral to try and speculate where somebody comes from and the background of a judgment of a particular officer. So that's why we can't bring you the totality of the background that they're from.
We do understand that. I mean, there's a real problem in asking people their religion and those now. But what we've suggested is, since we're not concerned with individual cases but with patterns, why can't you use the GPS systems that you have to find out locations of the searches, and then if we put them on the spatial maps, we can see pretty clearly where they're taking place.
It's a fair point. I think certainly we can say where. I think it'd still be dangerous to make assumptions about just because somebody is in a particular part of the city or the country that you might assume is linked to a particular community. It doesn't necessarily mean that that person was from there. So I think that could end up accelerating certain assumptions about stereotyping or bias. So that I think definitely we can give you trends and where, but the community background is going to be quite a difficult issue for us to resolve.
Brice?
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, at the last meeting of the board in public in June, your predecessor undertook to produce a report for the board
on the investigation conducted by Durham Constabulary into the legal information from the Ombudsman's office that was used in the No Stone Unturned film concerning the Lough Island atrocity. Your office kindly sent us that report last Friday, I believe it was, and it's emerged from that report that Durham Constabulary was asked to undertake that investigation because they were already undertaking an investigation into a leak or theft, possibly, from the police ombudsman's office. That came, I think, as news to the board. So I'm wondering, could you just tell us what that other investigation was about? And is it linked, possibly, to the No Stone Unturned leak? And are you expecting to get reports from Durham Constabulary on both investigations by the end of this year?
I think working backwards, Brice, that's the expectation we set out to Mike Barton, who's now former Chief Constable but still holds the investigative responsibility, that we expect a report into his work by the end of the year, which will give us some clarity about his judgments. I don't really know the detail in relation to the investigation that set this off and who was told about what and when. I think we'd be a bit cautious about going into too much detail here, as the investigation that Mike is conducting is live and running. So I think it's maybe something we can either write to you or speak to you offline before we frustrate maybe the judgments you might be making, because this isn't a public domain.
Thank you. Just in relation to the Durham investigation, I mean, the issue of the two journalists that were arrested has been raised on numerous occasions here on the board. Thankfully, are no longer subject to investigation. But there is a concern that information that was garnered from what is now through the courts being deemed an illegal search warrant, through computers, phones, personal private information and journalistic information, is still being held on the police system. I mean, I'm led to believe that information is digitalised for a month and then transferred to a tape. And in this case, the PSNI seem intent in holding on to the information for 10 years. So I mean, I would have concerns that the PSNI police are trying to hold on to information that was part of an investigation that's no longer ongoing, but was also part of an investigation that was conducted through an illegal search warrant. So I mean, I would like you to comment on that if you can. But also, I mean, the general term of it was happening in this case, is it happening in other cases? I mean, as the PSNI get information of people that are no part of an investigation or whatever, and how that complies with GDPR legislation.
Again, there's a lot of specifics there, both with GDPR and also the management of police information, which gives protocols for how we should be doing that appropriately. I think, again, I've got to be careful what I say in the public domain, because we have launched a legal challenge to a previous ruling, so I wouldn't be wanting to do anything that usurped both our own argument or the views of a judge. I think, for clarity, we have returned the physical evidence in all its forms that we were required to do so to the two journalists. I think what you're hinting at is about the digital footprint of that information and how that sort of runs through the systems that PSNI holds. And the basis of our argument is the practicalities and proportionality of seeking to completely remove that information because of the way it's stored in code. So my understanding is that information is not there in a way that's visible, a bit like a photograph, but it may exist in zeros and ones that amount to the digital footprint. And we'll have to await the judgment to see if we've got to do more work to try and remove it. But my understanding at the moment is that we're technically nigh impossible and also extremely costly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chief Constable, thank you for your recent public acknowledgement in a media article that the confidence of the PUL community in PSNI is not where it should be, nor where we would like it to be. The summer months have seen a significant increase in Republican activity, and in a June meeting with your predecessor, I raised the issue of gunfire at 2 funerals, and I would like an update on all of these cases with regard to shows of strength. But the fact remains that it's happened a 3rd time now, with children in the front row and with some not even bothering to cover their faces, clearly with no fear of repercussion. I gave a public commitment that I would raise this with the police, and the response from my community to me was, what's the point? And that goes a long way to demonstrating the feeling in my community that there is 2-tier policing, and more than that, that you're more likely to be arrested for wearing an armband of Her Majesty's forces than you are for firing guns in an estate in Belfast. So what do you have to say to these people who feel this way, who feel that there is no point and that the action is insufficient? And more importantly, what action will you take to restore confidence in the PSNI that people will not get away with bringing guns onto the streets of Belfast and glorifying terrorism? Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I think, firstly, there were, I think, 3 recent funerals that you're probably referring to, and there has been different types of policing operation on the day of the funeral in relation to each, both to have officers available to deal with any scenarios you might anticipate, as well as to gather evidence. There are some active lines of inquiry that we're following in relation to, I think, the concern on the most recent discharge of a firearm over an open coffin. I think we're not yet in a position to say that that was necessarily taking place on the same day as the funeral, and that may be adding to some of the confusion, but also about setting the bounds, I think, as to what's practical in terms of the policing response, where there are some limits about what we can do, and also acknowledging that many funerals take place with people from the past where there were no firearms discharged and no threat to public order or anything else. I do recognise the concern because we've had a number of conversations about it in the meetings that Mervyn acknowledged. I do not recognise, but I accept perception is everything, the notion of 2-tier policing. Fairness and impartiality precedes me, but it's something that I hold dear, and I'm determined to make sure that we police with equality right across the policing domain. Sometimes it's difficult to compare how we, for example, police a response to a funeral, to a march or parade, which I think has caused some of the frustration. But I'm determined that we do all we can to strike the right balance, and that we will continue in the future, if the intelligence takes us down that route, to gather evidence of future funerals and to pursue active lines of criminal investigation if firearms are discharged.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. Chief Constable, just a few weeks ago, the Belfast Telegraph carried an article about, based on statistics they received from the PSNI about people who go missing. And I think they were quoting that 30 people in Northern Ireland, around 30 people every day go missing. Many of them young people, and I know that you do commit a lot of resource to trying to find these people, and particularly when in cases of vulnerable people. I know you put a big effort into to find vulnerable people. But just, you may not be able to answer this today, and I'd be happy if you get back to me on it, but how would the figures in Northern Ireland compare with other regions in the United Kingdom in terms of the number of people who go missing?
On the specifics, I don't know, and I will have to come back to you. On the approach, from my understanding, it's similar. So when you get people that go missing as individuals repeatedly, or from places repeatedly, we do work in a problem-solving environment with other agencies to try and look at root causes and deter that, because there could be a variety of reasons. And also, you talked about young people spot the signs of vulnerability and exploitation, be it human slavery or child sexual exploitation, because it's not just about the fact they've gone missing, but why and some of the underlying causes. But we can get those figures for you, Alan, and send them out separately in the written response.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
That concludes the questions, Chief Constable, for your first board meeting. A little bit over time, but we haven't had a meeting for a month, so I think we can give the back. So thanks to you and the senior team for coming along today. And our next public